Consider your garden for a moment. Have you seen how it transforms when you begin giving it proper attention? Weeds that dominated the space gradually disappear. Flowers that struggled to survive now flourish beautifully. And that seemingly lifeless old tree starts producing new branches. Quite remarkable, wouldn't you say? Your life works the same way. When you start tending to yourself, nurturing your worth, and standing tall in your value, things change. People change. Relationships change. And yes, some folks walk away. Hello, let me tell you something important today. When certain people leave your life after you begin loving yourself, that's not a loss. That's a necessary clearing. That's making room for what belongs in the garden of your life. Now I know what some of you are thinking. Jim, that sounds nice, but I lost people I cared about. Yes, you did. And today we're going to talk about why that happened, why it needed to happen, and why your future is brighter because of it. Most folks get this all backward. They think loving yourself means becoming selfish. They think it means putting yourself first at the expense of others. They worry about what people will say if they start respecting their own time, their own boundaries, their own needs. But here's what I've learned through years of studying successful people. Self-love isn't selfish. It's necessary. It's fundamental. It's the foundation everything else is built on. You know, when I was young, I had a mentor who told me, Jim, you can't give what you don't have. Simple words, profound truth. If you don't have respect for yourself, how can you offer respect to others? If you don't value your time, how can you value the time of others? If you don't believe in your worth, how can you recognize worth in those around you? And here's where most people get stuck. They spend years, sometimes decades, trying to prove their worth to others. They bend themselves into shapes that aren't natural. They say yes when they want to say no. They stay quiet when they need to speak up. They settle for less because they believe that's all they deserve. I remember talking to a woman after one of my seminars. Tears in her eyes, she told me she'd spent 20 years trying to please a husband who was never satisfied. 20 years trying to earn the approval of friends who talked behind her back. 20 years putting everyone else first until she forgot who she was. What changed? I asked her. I did, she said. I started saying no. I started speaking up. I started valuing myself. And you know what happened? My husband left. Half my friends disappeared. And for the first time in 20 years, I felt free. That's what we're talking about today. The misconception most people have about self-love is thinking it's something soft, something weak. They picture bubble baths and affirmations in the mirror. Now, there's nothing wrong with taking care of yourself that way. But real self-love, that's made of sterner stuff. Real self-love is having the courage to look yourself in the eye and be honest about who you are. It's setting standards for how you'll be treated. It's walking away from situations that diminish you. It's investing in your growth even when nobody else believes in it. And let me tell you, that kind of self-love isn't always comfortable. It doesn't always feel good in the moment. Sometimes it means standing alone. Sometimes it means being misunderstood. Sometimes it means watching people walk out of your life. I talk to people all across this country, all over the world. And one thing I hear constantly is this fear. If I change, will I lose the people I love? And my answer is always the same. Some of them, yes. And that's how you'll know you're growing. You see, relationships are like elevators. They can only go as high as both people are willing to go. When you decide to rise, when you start climbing toward a better version of yourself, not everyone will come along for the ride. That's not a tragedy. That's just how life works. I remember when I first started changing my life, I was tired of being broke, tired of making excuses, tired of living below my potential. So I started reading books, started attending seminars, started hanging around different kinds of people. And you know what happened? Some of my old buddies started making jokes. Look at Jim with his books. Look at Jim with his goals. Look at Jim thinking he's better than us. I wasn't thinking I was better than anyone. I was just trying to get better than I had been. But that distinction was lost on them. Because when you start to change, it holds a mirror up to the people around you. It asks questions they might not be ready to answer. There comes a moment in every person's growth when you have to make a choice. Will you shrink back to make others comfortable, or will you continue growing even if it means growing apart? That moment is different for everyone. For some, it's when they decide to quit drinking. For others, it's when they start a business. For others still, it's when they finally say no more to a relationship that's been hurting them for years. Whatever that moment is for you, recognize it for what it is. Not an ending, but a beginning. Not a loss, but an opening for something new. Now, let's talk about why people leave when you start loving yourself. Because understanding this will free you from taking it personally. First, some people are comfortable with the old you. They know how to interact with that person. They know what to expect. When you change, you disrupt that comfort. You become unpredictable. You stop playing the role they've assigned you. Second, your growth reminds them of their stagnation. When you start improving, it suggests they could improve too. If they're not ready to face that, it's easier to dismiss your changes or walk away entirely. Third, some relationships were built on a foundation of your low self-worth. Maybe you were the friend who always said yes, who never complained, who put everyone else first. Maybe you were the spouse who tolerated disrespect, who worked to earn love, who settled for crumbs of affection. When you stop accepting that role, the relationship loses its structure. Fourth, and this is important, some people genuinely want the best for you, but simply aren't equipped for the new you. They may love you dearly, but not know how to support your growth. It doesn't make them bad people. It just means your paths are diverging. I've seen this happen countless times. The woman who loses weight and her husband sabotages her efforts. The man who starts a business and his friends mock his ambition. The person who seeks therapy and their family tells them to stop dwelling on the past. It's not that these people are villains in your story. They're just characters who belong in a different chapter. And here's something else I want you to understand. When people leave because you started loving yourself, they're not rejecting the real you, they're rejecting the change. They're rejecting the disruption to their expectations. They're rejecting the mirror you've become. The real you, they never knew that person because you were only just beginning to know that person yourself. Let's talk about the power of genuine self-worth. Because once you understand this, you'll never go back to dimming your light for others. Genuine self-worth isn't about thinking you're perfect. It's not about believing you're better than others. It's simply about recognizing your inherent value as a human being and acting accordingly. When you operate from this place, everything changes. Your decisions change, your relationships change, your future changes. You stop chasing approval, you stop explaining yourself, you stop apologizing for taking up space in the world. I had a friend who spent years trying to win over his father's approval. No matter what he accomplished, it was never enough. One day, after another disappointing interaction, he had a realization. I don't need his approval anymore. I approve of myself. That simple shift changed everything for him. He stopped structuring his life around winning validation. He started making choices based on his own values, and interestingly, his relationship with his father eventually improved. Not because his father changed, but because my friend was no longer approaching from a place of need. That's the power of genuine self-worth. It doesn't just change how others see you. It changes how you see others. When you value yourself properly, you start to recognize value in others more clearly. You stop putting people on pedestals. You stop accepting disrespect. You start choosing relationships that are balanced, honest, and mutually beneficial. And yes, that means some relationships won't make the cut. Think about it this way. If you've been settling for less in your relationships, if you've been the one always giving, always accommodating, always forgiving, without receiving the same in return, then raising your standards will naturally filter some people out of your life. It has to, because water seeks its own level. But here's what most people miss about this process. It's not just about removing what doesn't work. It's about creating space for what could be. Nature abhors a vacuum. When you remove low-quality relationships from your life, you create room for higher quality connections. When you stop spending time with people who drain you, you have more energy for those who inspire you. When you quit trying to please those who can't be pleased, you free yourself to serve those who appreciate your gifts. I want to talk about the transformation process, because loving yourself enough to let certain people go isn't something that happens overnight. It's a process, sometimes a painful one. First comes awareness. You start noticing the imbalances in your relationships. You recognize the patterns of giving too much and receiving too little. You become conscious of how certain interactions leave you feeling drained, diminished, or disrespected. Next comes the decision. You decide things need to change. You commit to valuing yourself more highly. You begin to envision a life where you're treated with the respect you deserve. Then comes action. You start setting boundaries. You begin speaking your truth. You stop volunteering for the role of doormat. You quit making excuses for people who consistently hurt you. And finally comes the hardest part, allowing the consequences to unfold. Watching as some people rise to meet the new you and others fall away. Feeling the temporary loneliness that sometimes comes with growth. Trusting that what awaits you is better than what you're leaving behind. This transformation isn't linear. You'll have days when you fall back into old patterns. You'll have moments when the pain of losing someone tempts you to shrink again, to go back to the person you were. In those moments, remember this: the price of pretending to be less than you are is too high. The cost of denying your worth for the comfort of others is your own life. I remember a young man who came to one of my seminars. He'd recently ended a 10-year relationship. I finally told her what I needed, he said. I finally stood up for myself, and she left. How do you feel? I asked him. He thought for a moment. Sad, he said, but also like I can breathe again. That's often how it feels. A mixture of loss and liberation, of grief and possibility. But as time passes, the grief fades and the possibility grows. You start to see your worth wasn't the problem. The problem was trying to convince others of a worth they weren't equipped to recognize. Now let's talk about building new relationships from this place of self-love, because that's the beautiful part of this journey. It's not just about who leaves, it's about who comes next. When you value yourself properly, you start attracting people who value you too. When you set healthy boundaries, you draw in people who respect boundaries. When you speak your truth, you connect with those who appreciate honesty. Like tuning a radio to a different frequency. Suddenly you're picking up signals you couldn't hear before. I've watched this happen with countless people. The businessman who stopped trying to impress everyone and started attracting genuine partners. The woman who quit accepting mistreatment and found herself surrounded by supportive friends. The artist who stopped underselling their work and began finding clients who paid what they were worth. These new relationships have a different quality to them. They're not built on need or fear or obligation. They're built on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine appreciation. And here's the interesting thing. Some of these new relationships might be with people who were in your life all along but operating at the periphery. People you didn't notice because you were too busy trying to please those who couldn't be pleased. People who were waiting for you to recognize your own worth so they could connect with you authentically. Building these new relationships requires courage. It means risking rejection again. It means being vulnerable with people after you've been hurt. It means trusting your judgment when your judgment has failed you before. But each time you enter a relationship from a place of self-worth, you strengthen that muscle. You get better at recognizing who deserves your time and energy. You become more skilled at spotting the warning signs of those who would diminish you. And gradually you create a circle around you of people who celebrate your growth rather than resent it. People who want you to shine because your light doesn't threaten them. People who hold you accountable to your highest self rather than tempting you back into old patterns. This doesn't happen by accident. It happens by design, by your design. Creating boundaries is essential in this process. Because loving yourself isn't just about how you feel about yourself. It's about how you allow others to treat you. Boundaries aren't walls. They're guidelines. They're the rule book for how to interact with you. They show others how to treat you by demonstrating how you treat yourself. Most people struggle with boundaries because they've been taught that having them is selfish. They worry that stating their needs will drive others away, and sometimes it will. But those aren't the people who belonged in your life anyway. Healthy boundaries might sound like, I need some time to think about that before I give you an answer. I'm not comfortable with that kind of joke. I can help you on Tuesday, but the rest of my week is committed. I care about you, but I won't participate in that behavior. Notice that none of these statements are attacks. They don't blame or criticize the other person. They simply assert your needs, your values, your limits. When you first start setting boundaries, it can feel awkward, unnatural. You might worry you're being too harsh or too selfish, but with practice, it becomes second nature. It becomes part of how you honor yourself and others. And yes, some people won't like your boundaries. Some will push against them, test them, try to make you feel guilty for having them. That's when you know your boundary was necessary. That's when you recognize the relationship was built on an unhealthy foundation. I talked to a business owner who struggled with a particular client. This client would call at all hours, demand immediate responses, and treat my friend's team disrespectfully. Finally, my friend set clear boundaries about communication hours and acceptable treatment of his staff. The client left, took their business elsewhere. My friend worried he'd made a mistake. 6 months later, his business was thriving. His team was happier. His other clients were getting better service. And the energy he'd spent managing that difficult relationship was now directed toward. Sometimes what looks like a loss is actually clearing the way for gain. Let's talk about measuring true success in this journey. Because it's not just about who stays and who goes. It's about who you become in the process. Most people measure the success of relationships by their longevity. A 20-year marriage must be better than a 5-year one. A childhood friendship must be more valuable than one formed in adulthood. But time is only one measure, and often not the most important one. The true measure of a relationship's success is how it affects the people within it. Does it encourage growth or stagnation? Does it multiply joy or divide it? Does it heal wounds or create new ones? When you start loving yourself enough to let certain relationships go, you begin measuring success differently. You look at how you feel day to day. You notice whether you're moving toward your goals or away from them. You pay attention to whether your interactions leave you energized or depleted. I knew a woman who ended a 30-year friendship. From the outside, this looked like failure. But she told me, for 30 years, I left every interaction feeling slightly worse about myself. I finally realized that's 30 years too long. She was right. The success of that relationship wasn't in its duration, but in the lesson it eventually taught her about her own worth. As you continue on this path of self-love, you'll start noticing subtle shifts in how you evaluate your life. Success becomes less about external validation and more about internal alignment. Less about pleasing others and more about being true to yourself. You'll find yourself asking different questions. Not what will they think, but what do I believe? Not how can I get them to approve, but how can I act with integrity? Not why don't they see my worth, but how am I honoring my worth today? These shifts change everything. They change your choices. They change your relationships. They change your future. And here's something remarkable that happens. As you become more comfortable with your own worth, as you stop requiring others to validate it, you become more capable of genuine connection. Paradoxically, needing relationships less makes you better at building them. Because you're no longer coming from a place of lack, but from a place of fullness. This brings us to the legacy of self-respect. Because how you treat yourself doesn't just affect you. It affects everyone around you. It sets a standard. It creates a ripple. I've seen parents transform their children's futures by modeling self-respect. I've watched business leaders change entire company cultures by valuing themselves appropriately. I've observed friends influence their social circles just by raising their personal standard. When you refuse to accept disrespect, you make it safer for others to do the same. When you speak your truth, you give others permission to find their voice. When you walk away from what diminishes you, you show others it's possible to choose a different path. This is a legacy that outlasts you. It continues in the lives you touch, in the examples you set, in the standards you establish. I think of a teacher I once knew. For years, she allowed her administrators to pile more and more responsibilities on her without additional compensation or recognition. She worked nights and weekends. She depleted her health. She neglected her family. One day, she decided enough was enough. She set clear boundaries around her time. She began saying no to additional tasks without additional support. She started leaving work at work. Some of her colleagues criticized her, called her selfish, said she didn't care about the students. The administration was unhappy with her new boundaries. But something interesting happened. Other teachers started following her example. They too began setting limits. They too started valuing their time. And eventually, the school had to change its expectations, had to start respecting the teacher's boundaries, had to find more sustainable ways to meet student needs. One person's self-respect created a wave of positive change that benefited everyone, including the students, who now had healthier, more present teachers. That's the power of loving yourself enough to set standards. It doesn't just change your life, it has the potential to change many lives. As we come to the end of our time together, I want to leave you with some thoughts to carry forward. Because this journey of self-love, of letting go of relationships that no longer serve you, it's not a one-time event. It's an ongoing practice, a lifetime commitment to your own worth. First, understand that loving yourself isn't selfish. It's necessary. It's the foundation everything else is built on. Without it, you're trying to construct a life on shifting sand. Second, recognize that people leaving your life isn't always a tragedy. Sometimes it's a graduation, a sign that you've outgrown a certain classroom and are ready for the next level of learning. Third, know that loneliness is sometimes part of the process. The gap between old relationships and new ones can feel empty, but that emptiness is fertile ground for growth. It's in those quiet moments you often find your strongest voice. Fourth, be patient with yourself. You didn't develop low self-worth overnight. And you won't develop healthy self-love in a day either. There will be steps forward and steps back. The key is to keep moving in the right direction. Fifth, remember that your worth isn't determined by who stays or who goes. Your worth is inherent. It exists whether anyone recognizes it or not. But when you recognize it, you give others the opportunity to see it too. And finally, understand that this journey isn't just about you. It's about everyone your life touches. When you value yourself appropriately, you change the ecosystem around you. You create new possibilities, not just for yourself, but for others. I've talked to thousands of people over the years. I've heard countless stories of transformation. And one thing I've noticed is this. The people who learn to love themselves, who have the courage to let go of relationships that diminish them, who set standards and hold to them, even when it's difficult, these people don't end up alone. They end up surrounded by quality, by relationships that nourish rather than deplete, by connections built on mutual respect rather than need or habit or fear. They create lives that reflect their true worth, and in doing so, they inspire others to do the same. So yes, some people laugh because you started loving yourself. Let them go with gratitude for the lessons they taught you, and then turn your face toward what's coming, toward the relationships that will meet you at your level, toward the connections that will celebrate your worth rather than diminish it, toward the future that becomes possible when you finally, fully recognize the value of who you are. That future is waiting for you. All you have to do is take the next step, and the next, and the next, until one day you look around and realize you've created exactly the life and relationships you deserve. Not because you finally convinced others of your worth, but because you finally convinced yourself.